Chapter 3. Preparing for North America. The 1845 to 1859 Brethren Schism produced a new vocabulary of division. The most common form in historical discussion is to refer to open versus exclusive brethren, but to be aware that contemporaries employed a variety of terms. Awareness of the distinction between the sides is necessary, but should not obscure the things they still held in common. Particularly relevant to the Brethren incursion into North America is a set of reflexes that were well in place before the faithful split. These were the instinctive commitment to mission work that was individually directed and was independent of the existing evangelical missionary societies. In secular terms, the Brethren were committed to incursions into other cultures that, if done in the world of commerce, would have been described as small-scale entrepreneurship. For instantiation of the assertion that the Brethren's missionary reflexes were laid down before the Great Schism, we should step back. In the mid-1830s and thereafter in the British Isles, the modern concept of faith missions was developed, something quite different from the standard Protestant mission entities of the period that were centralized organizations with loads of rules and with headquarters and financing in a metropole. The Brethren efforts, in contrast, were individual initiatives and were self-financed. The way they approached missions any place in the world relied on a set of reflexes that perforce applied when they approached North America. There's a mild problem here. The historiography of evangelicalism in the United States in the second half of the 19th century deals well with home missions, meaning domestically generated outreach efforts, with European-guided support of ethnic religious minorities, and with American mission groups founded to bring evangelical salvation to the benighted foreign parts of the world. Evangelical missions to the general population of America from international outsiders are not well integrated into the post-Civil War story. Understandably, no one wants to be in need of such help. For a sector of mid-Victorian evangelicals, and certainly for the Brethren in the British Isles, the Americans were considered to be a strange, often brutalized, spiritually wastrel people, requiring of spiritual aid. In Brethren prayer sessions and in meetings in support of foreign faith missions, the inhabitants of North America were placed in the same broad category as the Chinese, Africans, and Caribbean and Polynesian islanders. North America, and especially the United States, was for a time considered a massive opportunity for faith missions. The missioners used British North America as an entry corridor. The early Brethren missionaries were more comfortable there than in the, in their view, raw and acquisitive republic. They soon got over that. The network of saints and assemblies that began in Canada was foundational in providing a base for the development of the ideas and the broader personal associations that became dispensationalism in the United States and ultimately a core component of fundamentalism. As unconsciously imperialistic and overtly patronizing as the array of British-based evangelical missions in North America sometimes may have been, the Brethren themselves were modest in the claims for their own faith missions, appropriately so in regard to their early efforts, which were far from being earth-shaking, because the usual Brethren missionary effort was self-directed, sometimes involving only 2 or 3 individuals and producing few records, no reports to headquarters. There is no sense in trying to define a full taxonomy. Instead, we can observe the 2 major styles of Brethren faith missions as practiced by Anthony Norris Groves and John Nelson Darby. That Groves is often treated as the father figure of the Open Brethren, and that Darby became the leader of the Exclusive Brethren, is here irrelevant. Their main difference as missionaries is that Groves worked at converting non-Europeans in distant lands, and Darby tailored his work to audiences in the predominantly Christian countries. Groves, from a Hampshire merchant family, was a West Country English dentist with some education and skill in clinical medicine at a time when most dentists had neither. His patron, an uncle, had a fashionable London practice with access to good hospitals, and these had provided young Groves with some surgical training and practice in compounding drugs. Groves underwent an evangelical conversion in his late teens and became convinced that he should be a purveyor of faith to heathen lands. That was not a rare step, and certainly there were societies available to support educated young persons with that goal. The Church Missionary Society was the most obvious, and for a time Groves planned to be ordained and go out under its auspices. In 1825, he published Christian Devotedness, a slight, gloriously naive, convincingly earnest volume that put forward an agenda for the Christian life in general, and secondarily constituted a manifesto for faith missions. The headline text was Jesus' words, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth." Groves's explication de texte was a rocket aimed at every believer, and his readers were surprised to find that Groves really meant it when he said that every Christian, not just the professionally religious, should renounce wealth and become poor for the gospel. What was new in regard to missions was Groves's assertion that the biblical imperative of preaching the gospel to every human being in the world, Mark chapter 16 verse 15 is the proof text, was impossible without the renunciation of worldly wealth. Waiting for the message, Groves said, were 600 million souls. Groves, planning to become ordained, studied as an extramural student at Trinity College, Dublin, 1826 to 1829. He was a founding member of the Brethren, and in 1829 decided to drop his degree course, forget about ordination, and follow the steps of St. Paul and go on a faith mission for real. No supporting institution, just faith and a few comrades. Groves, with no organizational backup, no training in Arabic, and little knowledge of Islam, decided on founding a mission in Baghdad. His solo enterprise was bankrolled in large part by his having married a semi-heiress worth something over £10,000 that became available in late 1828 or early 1829. That makes the implicit point that this model for early faith missions was not so much based on renouncing wealth as it was about spending it. In mid-June 1829, Groves and his party left Gravesend on a private yacht, flying the ensign of the Royal Yacht Squadron, owned and captained by his friend John Vesey Parnell, later Lord Congleton, one of the Dublin Brethren. In the party with Groves was his wife and their 2 boys, 9 and 10 years old, the family tutor, a couple of missionary assistants, and some other persons who were useful supercargo, notably the Armenian wife of the British resident in Baghdad, Major Robert Taylor, and her retinue, which included her lady's maid, a bodyguard, and 2 other servants. Surprisingly, instead of taking the safest route to Baghdad, via India and the Persian Gulf, Groves and his party shipped to St. Petersburg, Russia, and then proceeded south for half a continent of a land journey. After 6 months of total journeying, Groves's party arrived in Baghdad, and he began his efforts towards converting Muslims to Christianity. He operated a general clinic, and a school was set up for Armenian Christians. Groves's wife died. A horrific cholera epidemic swept through the Middle East. A relief party was sent out from England, one that produced its own mini-epic of ineptness as it sailed through the Mediterranean and into war-torn lands on the way to Baghdad, a trip that necessitated 15 months balked in Aleppo. When the relief party finally reached Baghdad, its members experienced deep frustration in working at a mission station that converted no one. Actually, that was not quite the case. There were 2 mission conversions between 1829 and 1833, an Armenian man and Groves's own eldest son, Henry. Nevertheless, Anthony Norris Groves's Baghdad mission was a success, not because its rewards were so great, but because its human cost was so high. As mentioned, Groves's wife died, and also their infant daughter, as did the mother of Dr. Edward Cronin, who came in the relief party with his family. Cronin's sister Nancy also died. She had married John Vesey Parnell, Lord Congleton, 1842, on the outward journey of the relief party, and took ill and died before making Baghdad. Groves, who was a genuinely modest man except when doing the Lord's work, had arranged to make his story into a literary entity, and it turned out to be one of the first of the Empire and Beyond genre of English adventure memoirs, albeit unintentionally. While still in St. Petersburg, he engaged couriers to take his letters and dispatches to people at home. His travel adventure memoir was published in London in mid-1831. Once he settled in Baghdad, Groves began his own Diary of the Plague Years, and it came out in London in mid-1832. And thereby, the Baghdad mission became a success. Anthony Norris Groves etched a pattern for later faith missionaries. Trust totally in the Lord, although a bit more planning would not be impious. Don't talk about money, for He will provide, more readily granted to those who already have funds. Suffer heroically, like an early Christian martyr. Don't complain. Groves's quiet acceptance of his misadventures was not feigned, and keep the home front well informed. Sound advice. In more generalized terms, a 4-square platform was thereby built for later Brethren faith missions, primarily for those in non-European countries. It was also adopted by some other non-denominational evangelical mission groups, most notably the epical China Inland Mission. The platform was as follows. 1. Missions were lay movements, no clergy as such, although they could participate. 2. The on-the-field missionaries were expected to fund themselves, either by having family money or by raising support at home in a manner that stopped short of outright solicitation. 3. The missionary enterprises were not to be denominationally sponsored or to be part of consortia formally sponsored by multiple denominations. And 4. To the extent that home-based support groups developed, those groups were not in charge. The pace and practice of spreading the faith was to be determined by the workers on the ground. The second document in the file on early Brethren faith missions consists of the activities of John Nelson Darby in the Protestant portions of Switzerland, 1837 to 1845. It was chiefly applied to work in Christian nations. Such places were where he worked throughout his life, and it is relevant that these were sites provided good communication networks with the English and Irish homelands. He always kept in close touch. As with the example of Anthony Norris Groves, our interest here is to indicate the reflexes and postures that were embedded in the neural networks of Brethren faith missioners before they turned towards North America. Darby's instincts and personality made his missionary work much different from Groves's in that he was hyper-intense, combative, quite effective, but resolutely non-autobiographical when describing his work. His earliest mission field was among Europeans, with whom he had a close cultural understanding and whose languages he mastered. Darby's linguistic facility was one of his major talents. Unlike Groves, he could not credibly assert that his efforts were aimed at those who had never heard the Christian gospel, but he was not at all shy in asserting that they had never heard it properly presented until he did so. Darby's immediate mission field from 1837 to 1845 was the west of Switzerland, specifically the cantons of Geneva and of Vaud, with its capital in Lausanne. This was Reformed Protestant territory, with almost 300 years of intertwined civil religious history behind it, and plenty of opportunities to develop declensions from the established Protestant faith, these being referred to in translation as Old Dissent, and also from the freer forms of Protestantism that were deep in their interrogation of the Scriptures, and often animated by experiences of the Holy Spirit. Darby targeted the Bible reading assemblies that were closest to his own views. In going after Protestants to convert, Darby was defining operationally an approach that throughout his career his critics decried rhetorically. He practiced what they commonly called sheep-stealing. In his opening years in Switzerland, Darby worshipped with independent local fellowships and tried to break through the rigid propriety of the pastors of Old Dissent. By the spring of 1840, he was squabbling with his Free Church colleagues in Geneva. "I find myself suddenly arrested in my course," he told a friend. "All the pastors of the so-called churches, I abhor the name now, stood aloof and let the wolf do what he might. Were not the Lord giving him strength, he would step aside and let them all ruin themselves." Darby's response was to produce a formidable set of 11 lectures, his first major public articulation of his maturing theology. Given in French, first in Geneva in November 1840, and later in Lausanne, these addresses were published in French and subsequently translated into English as "The Hopes of the Church of God in Connection with the Destiny of the Jews and the Nations as Revealed in Prophecy." Darby's Free Church critics, evangelical to the core themselves, held a series of conferences in 1843 that focused on his alleged doctrinal and ecclesiastical errors. Darby was in and out of Switzerland from mid-1843 onwards, and was almost completely done there in 1845, coincident with nationalist rioting of that year that made foreign-influenced conventicles open to attack. Exactly what John Nelson Darby's faith mission in Switzerland left behind is unclear, but there was something tangible. At least 2 significant congregations, with perhaps 60 faithful in each of the 2 cantons, and some smaller assemblies. Darby had conducted a colloquium for young male converts, and he left behind a cadre of a dozen or so keen young men who were willing to become full-time, self-financed evangelists. Darbyites, Darbistes, and Darbistin became the vernacular label for small Brethren-style assemblies that spread in pockets of Switzerland, France, and later Germany and Holland. In 1855, Darby estimated that there were about 50 fellowships in operation in Europe, the largest with about 200 faithful. The 2 earliest Brethren missions, those of Groves and of Darby, provide the boundaries and precedents of Brethren faith missions in the 19th century. The boundaries encompassed other efforts, besides being precedent-setting themselves. Within these parameters, there were several other missions, many of them individual efforts that left few historical records. The contrasts between the faith missions of Anthony Norris Groves and of John Nelson Darby are obvious. yet one should not project into them the schismatic divisions of the later 1840s. The differences were situational, meaning largely determined by where they were working. We have yet to engage the character of the social arrangements that at the most basic level, human beings creating a social system that facilitates and enhances their everyday life, provided depth and resources for the Brethren expansion into North America. In the quarter century that followed the Brethren schism, roughly the years 1850 to 1875, the chief Brethren influence in North America was primarily, but not solely, that of the exclusives. Thus, the organization that John Nelson Darby built in the homeland is crucial. That Darby resolutely refused to admit he ever dealt in systems, either theological or organizational, is just another instance of the complicated wiring within the fellowship. In discussing the control system adopted by the exclusive Brethrenism, we are facilitated by four old-school concepts that for a century have been employed by historians and by historically minded theologians and historical sociologists. These are the related constructs of cult, sect, denomination, and state church. Crucially, each of these can be employed in a manner that is non-judgmental. One grants that no human expression is ever completely neutral in its subconscious connotations, but in practical terms, it is possible to sponge out the prejudice that may inhere in these four terms, and to use them as descriptors of separate styles of religious administration. Each refers to a manner in which adherents of a religious group manages their relationship with each other. As a historian, I am quite aware that we often are inefficient. We frequently document a patch of human activity in close and verifiable detail, and only incidentally or accidentally employ a vocabulary that allows linkage to similar or related studies. One frequently discovers that a general vocabulary of analysis develops after several historical scholars have dealt with matters they thought were separate and subsequently are found to be part of a set or of a sequence. This was the case of the quite separate work of three major scholars who in the first 30 years of the 20th century had a formative influence not only on their own specialties, but upon the way historians of Western Christianity subsequently have worked. Ernst Troeltsch, 1865 to 1923, Max Weber, 1864 to 1920, and H. Richard Niebuhr, 1894 to 1962. Their generative contributions in their own fields, respectively theology and church history, economics and sociology, and theological ethics, all involved observations and arguments from large historical data sets. From roughly the early 1930s onwards, scholars who engaged Western Christianity assimilated their work into a sequence of observations that formed the boundaries of discussion. Ernst Troeltsch, professor of theology at Heidelberg University, published his monumental study on longue durée Christian social structures in German in 1911. It was translated into English in 1931 as The Social Teachings of the Christian Churches, and it quickly became a cutting-edge analytic among theologians and religious historians in the English-speaking world. The second massive figure, Max Weber, was holder of successive chairs of economics in Heidelberg, Vienna, and Munich universities. His summative Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft was published posthumously in 1921 to 1922 and reframed a lifetime of extraordinary output in sociology, religion, economics, and history. Among other seminal ideas, he proposed charisma as a central concept in religious history, especially valuable for the understanding of small religious units. Portions of Weber's monumental work were translated into English in the 1930s, and these were succeeded in 1947 by a lapidary 2-volume English edition, edited by Talcott Parsons. The third major contributor to the historical vocabulary of Christian development in its Western variants was H. Richard Niebuhr, who was primarily an ethicist who employed historical concepts, particularly ecclesiological practices, to aid his understanding of the nature of Christianity. He did not believe that theology by itself served to define the faith. His early book, The Sources of Denominationalism, 1929, melded the work of Trulch and to a lesser extent Weber on European Christian history with the North American religious situation, with its then unusual domination by voluntary forms of religion that were free from state control. The four concepts that tumbled out of this cornucopia, cult, sect, denomination, state church, did not form a simple analytic agenda. These ideas were indeed closely related, but in the way entities in a constellation are related. Collectively, they formed slightly different patterns, just as a constellation does, depending on the angle of observation. Still, all were historically oriented, and taken together, they became the determinant of a vocabulary of historical analysis that was common to most mid-20th century religious history of Western religions done outside of narrowly prescriptive faith institutions. While we should be cognizant of the marginal differences in the way each of the four seminal constructs has been used by historians, these variances should not be disqualifying. Most usefully for our present purposes, cults are seen historically as small collectivities, frequently secretive about their core practices and mystical in their lived experience. Almost always they have involved charismatic leadership. Usually their organizational modes have been flexible, seemingly chaotic. But this plasticity is not to be confused with weakness. Sects, in distinction, have been put forward as wholesale withdrawal groups, declensions from larger bodies, such as denominations or state churches. Historically, they have been less dependent upon charismatic leaders, and more often given over to routinization in their worship styles and management patterns than have cults. Denominations, as introduced by Niebuhr, bridged to the North American situation, where there were large voluntary organizations that by the mid-19th century retained only pale vestiges of the classic European state church structure. Within the dominant historical literature, state churches, often called established churches, particularly in the British Isles, were a European phenomenon. Attempts at establishing formal state churches had effectively ended by the mid-19th century in the United States and Canada. Cults, sects, denominations, and state churches generally are placed in a continuum. Cults are seen as the most radical of the available forms of religious organization. They are viewed usually as dependent upon a charismatic leader, and by virtue of this dependence, to be inherently unstable. Sects are usually perceived as pivoting less around a single leader, but to be at odds with dominant religious tradition, whatever that may be. Usually they are an admixture of resentment and animation, a band of the elect. Denominations in this framework are relatively stable, multi-generational, and often quite effective in moderating the actions of persons outside their own fold. And state churches are just that, large, often hollow organizations that are expected to serve God and Mammon at the same time. A denomination can become a state church. A sect, or often a congery of sects, can become a denomination. A cult can turn into a sect, but only rarely does a cult jump directly to being a denomination. The distance in tone and in scale is just too far. A frequent criticism of the Troeltsch-Weber-Niebuhr template is that it is far too Christian, and that is fair if one is engaging non-Western religions. However, this analytic, informed as it is by an extraordinarily rich European and North American database, is here necessary. It is neither conceptually perfect nor academically fashionable, but it fits the historical situation that we are dealing with, which is Western, Christian, and Protestant, and is undeniably helpful. I favor a typology based on one dimension. In other words, one in which different cults, sects, and churches can be arranged along a continuum based on one variable. That is the dictum of Lorne L. Dawson in one of the most successful efforts at applying the historically rich cult-sect-church typology, while remaining aware that at present there are new faiths springing up all around the world. As for what this variable should be, I favor Weber's original choice for distinguishing churches and sects, the mode of membership of different groups, and the consequent form of their organization. In other words, the message of any faith group and its mode of social management can be analyzed separately, at least in the abstract. Ultimately, of course, organization and belief intermingle in each assembly and congregation.